Imagine a night where the rain itself seemed to conspire, hammering against towering windows as shadows twisted across polished mahogany and crackling hearths. It was March of 1847, in the heart of Virginia, and inside Thorngate Manor, a gathering of the elite was about to cross a line so obscene, so fundamentally human, that the echoes of that night would haunt generations. This wasn't a story of money, nor of land, nor even of fleeting reputation. The stakes were flesh, blood, and power, the ultimate measure of dominion over life itself. Colonel Harrison Rutherford, heir to one of Virginia's grandest plantations, presided over his domain like a sovereign over his green kingdom of tobacco fields. Men of wealth and influence moved at his side, men whose names alone could bend politics and markets. But that night, their gentlemanly poker game would mutate into something darker, a ritual, a test of the moral boundaries that even the most arrogant aristocrats believed they could never cross. At the table sat Harrison, flanked by Judge Cornelius Petton, Dr. Samuel Fitzgerald, and Marcus Bogard, men whose hands shaped laws, wealth, and futures in Virginia. And there, among them, was Caesar Wellington, a man whose intellect and financial acumen had begun to unravel the very assumptions of slavery. Born into bondage yet elevated to confidant, he existed as both tool and witness, his presence a subtle reminder that control was never as complete as men believed. The air in the room was thick with bourbon smoke, the sharp scent of expensive cigars curling through the lamplight. Yet beneath the veneer of leisure, tension coiled like a serpent. Each man's eyes flicked with calculation, not merely for the cards in their hands, but for the power, the dominance that could be claimed or lost in a single turn. And then Harrison made the decision that would shatter the delicate balance of their world. He raised the stakes, not with gold, not with land, but with the life of his daughter against the freedom of a man he had long relied upon. Margaret Rutherford, barely 18, her beauty and intelligence the pride of the family, was wagered as though she were a token. And Caesar, whose mind had guided fortunes and whose loyalty had been bought with respect rather than chains, stood on the other side of the table, the unthinkable suddenly real. The final card had yet to be revealed, but the consequences were already spiraling beyond comprehension. That night, the structures of power, trust, and morality in Virginia would begin to unravel. Families would die in secret, fortunes vanish, and whispers of conspiracy would echo through the halls of power for a century. Some truths, however, are too dangerous to be recorded. And this was one of them. By the time the rain had turned the roads to slick mirrors of shadow, Thorngate Manor had become more than a house, it was a crucible. Every polished surface reflected the ambitions, fears, and hidden corruption of men who believed themselves untouchable. Harrison's study, usually a place of strategy and calm authority, had transformed into a theater of impending disaster, a place where morality was auctioned off like a commodity. The four men at the table were not merely playing cards. They were testing one another's souls. Each gesture, each glance, each sip of bourbon carried a calculation. Marcus Bogard, the newcomer with a gambler's instinct honed in Charleston, studied his opponents as a predator reads prey. Judge Petton, whose legal mind had molded Virginia's very laws, measured not just the odds of the game, but the hidden pressures on each man's conscience. Dr. Fitzgerald's quiet demeanor was a mask. He analyzed every micro-expression, every twitch in muscle or eye, as if diagnosing moral frailty. And Harrison was at the center of it all, a man intoxicated with power, whose sense of control was absolute until that night. He had depended on Caesar Wellington, a man legally enslaved, yet intellectually emancipated, for every financial decision, every strategic choice. Caesar's presence was a mirror to Harrison's arrogance, reflecting back a truth the colonel had tried to ignore. Even the most powerful man can be ensnared by forces beyond his understanding. When Harrison declared the wager, silence descended like a physical weight. Margaret, standing quietly to the side, understood in an instant the magnitude of what had been uttered. Fear, anger, and disbelief mingled in her gaze. Caesar, calm yet resolute, felt the subtle shift in the room. The shift that revealed the fragile scaffolding of respect and loyalty was cracking. It was not the act itself, though unimaginable, but the implication that human lives could be manipulated for entertainment, for dominance, that marked the night as singularly corrupt. The game became a microcosm of the South itself. Rigid hierarchies, bound by law yet secretly governed by intimidation, greed, and unspoken agreements. Each card played, each raise, each bluff, carried weight far beyond its apparent value. The psychological pressure was relentless. Men who had long wielded influence with ease now confronted the raw reality of fear and consequence. Their identities, their social standing, even their very morality, was being tested under the harsh light of their own ambitions. And as the night wore on, the atmosphere thickened with a sense that what was unfolding was irreversible. Once the wager was made, there would be no turning back. In this room, in this single fateful evening, the structures of Virginia society, the elite networks, the unspoken codes of loyalty, and the illusions of absolute power began to tremble. And outside, beyond the walls of the manor, the world remained oblivious to the moral cataclysm being orchestrated within. The storm outside raged as though the heavens themselves understood the immorality taking place within Thorngate Manor. Margaret Rutherford, standing at the edge of the room, felt the weight of the world pivoting on a single monstrous decision. She was no longer merely a daughter. She had become a pawn, an emblem of power and dominance, a living wager in a game that stripped men of their humanity while cloaking cruelty in the guise of leisure. Harrison, flush with authority and a misguided sense of invincibility, could not see the full cost of his arrogance. To him, this was a test, a demonstration of supremacy over those around him, a reaffirmation of control. But Caesar Wellington, eyes sharp and calculating, saw deeper. He recognized that the act itself would fracture trust, unearth resentment, and ignite a chain reaction of consequences that no sum of money or land could contain. He understood that, in one moment, the moral code that held the plantation aristocracy together was about to be shattered irreparably. The other men at the table felt the subtle shift as well. Petton, who had spent decades shaping laws that upheld a society built on hierarchy, was momentarily unmoored. His legal mind had never anticipated encountering a situation so grotesquely ungovernable. The law could not protect innocence here, could not restrain the raw human impulses of pride, obsession, and cruelty. Fitzgerald, who had spent his life healing bodies, recognized the impossibility of mending what was now being broken within souls. And Marcus Bogard, ever the gambler, sensed the stakes were no longer numbers, they were lives, identities, and the invisible architecture of power itself. Every movement in the room became a negotiation with fear. The shuffle of cards, the clink of crystal glasses, even the rhythm of the rain on the windows was laden with ominous significance. The game transformed into a theater of moral horror, each play revealing the fragility of the men who thought themselves untouchable. What was entertainment became an act of revelation. The corruption, the hubris, and the hidden vulnerabilities of Virginia's elite were exposed under the harsh light of a wager that should never have existed. Margaret, whose education and refinement had been a source of pride, now confronted the terrifying truth of her existence in this world. She could be treated as property, as a measure of worth, as a disposable instrument for masculine dominance. Caesar, the enslaved yet brilliant confidant, felt the tightening of chains not literal, but psychological, imposed by the arrogance of men who believed intellect and skill could be owned. By the time the first card was laid down, the room was suffused with a tangible dread. Men who had prided themselves on intellect and control discovered that some forces, fear, morality, human life, could not be contained by wealth, pedigree, or strategy. And as the game edged forward, one truth became chillingly clear. That night would not merely settle a wager. It would unravel lives, reveal corruption at every level, and ignite a darkness that would ripple across Virginia for decades. The final card was laid with deliberate slowness, a rhythm that seemed to stretch time itself. Silence fell across Thorngate Manor, broken only by the relentless patter of rain against the windows and the soft crackle of the fireplace. Every man at the table, Harrison, Petton, Fitzgerald, Bogard, felt a shift in the air, a tangible weight pressing down on their chests. This was no longer a game. It was the moment when choices became consequences, when pride collided with morality, and when the fragile illusion of control disintegrated. When the card was revealed, Harrison's face betrayed the first flicker of uncertainty. The stakes he had so arrogantly set a daughter against the freedom of a man were no longer abstract. They were real, immediate, and horrifying. Margaret, pale yet defiant, understood with terrifying clarity that her life had been wagered without consent, without consideration, as though she were merely an object to be moved at will. Caesar, calm but unflinching, absorbed the gravity of the moment. He realized that no skill, no intellect, no loyalty could protect him from the cruelty embedded in the hearts of men who wielded power as a weapon. The room itself seemed to contract under the tension. Petton, the architect of law, felt the inadequacy of all statutes, all codes, all moral reasoning. Fitzgerald, the healer, felt a sickness rise that could not be cured with medicine. And Bogard, the gambler, whose life was built on reading others' weaknesses, found himself trapped in a game where the greatest vulnerability lay not in the cards but in the human conscience, flawed, corruptible, and, in that instant, exposed. Harrison's hubris had summoned forces he could not command. The moment the wager was sealed, the social equilibrium of Spotsylvania County began to fracture. Families whispered in fear. Alliances dissolved. Secrets that had been carefully guarded for decades began to leak into the open. The elite, who had once believed themselves untouchable, discovered that reputation and wealth could not shield them from the consequences of a single act of unrestrained dominance. And the ripple did not stop at the doors of Thorngate Manor. Rumors spread like wildfire, reaching the highest corridors of power in Virginia, infecting political alliances and financial networks alike. The incident became an unspoken stain on the state, a dark story that officials buried and documents that vanished because some truths, once unleashed, threatened the very foundation of society. That night, a line was crossed. The wager was no longer a question of morality or taste. It was a signal that corruption, when left unchecked, consumes everything it touches. And as the storm outside began to ease, a darker storm had been unleashed inside the hearts of men, a storm that would engulf Virginia, leaving death, ruin, and silence in its wake. In the weeks that followed, Thorngate Manor was no longer the bastion of authority it had once appeared to be. Whispers traveled through the county like smoke, carrying fragments of the night's horror to ears that were unprepared to comprehend it. Families that had once stood in rigid social hierarchy now glanced at one another with suspicion, knowing that the invisible rules governing their lives had been violated. A single reckless wager had revealed the fragility beneath decades of perceived power. Harrison Rutherford's dominance began to erode almost immediately. His financial ventures, once secure and carefully calculated, faltered under scrutiny and subtle sabotage from those who had witnessed the unraveling of his moral compass. Allies distanced themselves, fearful of entanglement in a scandal that could destroy not only reputation but livelihood. The carefully maintained networks of influence, the same networks that had allowed him to manipulate tobacco prices, railroads, and political appointments, began to collapse quietly, imperceptibly, but with devastating inevitability. And yet, the most insidious consequences were not merely financial. Murders, sudden deaths, and unexplained illnesses began to touch the families involved in that night's game. Some say it was divine retribution. Others claim calculated revenge orchestrated by those who remained loyal to Caesar Wellington. The truth was obscured in layers of secrecy, but the result was undeniable. The social order of Spotsylvania County was destabilized. Power was no longer absolute. Wealth could not shield men from consequence, and the illusion of control fractured into fear, paranoia, and desperation. The Rutherfords were haunted, not only by the external collapse of influence but by the private knowledge of their own cruelty. Margaret, once a symbol of grace and privilege, carried within her the weight of that night's horror, a psychological scar that few could understand, yet which reshaped her every interaction, every alliance, every decision. Caesar Wellington, whose intellect had long been weaponized for profit, now became a silent arbiter of moral reckoning. His mind, sharp as ever, could see the fractures forming in the elite, and he began to manipulate events subtly, turning the arrogance of men against itself. By the time the scandal faded from public awareness, its shadow had already etched itself into the foundation of Virginia society. Entire families were financially crippled, some wiped out entirely. Estates that had seemed untouchable fell to ruin. Political influence shifted, quietly, almost invisibly, as new players emerged from the ashes of arrogance and moral collapse. The night of the poker game became more than history, it became a template for the hidden power of consequences, a lesson in how a single act of hubris could dismantle centuries of influence. And in the shadows of Thorngate Manor, a warning lingered. The world rewards knowledge and cunning, yes, but it punishes recklessness, arrogance, and the illusion that humans can truly own one another. Every ripple from that night spoke of a truth men rarely confront. Power is never absolute, and every violation of conscience carries a cost that echoes across generations. Halfway through this story, I want you to pause. Comment below the phrase, "The cards never lie," and then again, "The cards never lie," to acknowledge that you're seeing through the veil, that you understand the hidden forces at play. This is a symbolic act, a lock-in of awareness, a subtle engagement with the forces that govern not just history, but the psychology of power itself. While the world outside Thorngate Manor continued its oblivious march, inside, a quieter, more dangerous reckoning had begun. Caesar Wellington, the man who had been legally enslaved yet intellectually emancipated, moved with a precision that was invisible to the untrained eye. He had long been a master of numbers, a keeper of accounts, and a strategist in a world that denied him freedom, but now, the stakes had transformed. This was no longer a game of finances. It was a game of psychology, morality, and influence. Caesar understood that the chaos triggered by Harrison's hubris could be wielded, if one knew where to place leverage. The arrogance of men like Harrison, Bogard, and Petton had created cracks, tiny fissures in the veneer of social control that could be widened into catastrophic fractures. Every whispered rumor, every subtle hint of scandal, became a tool. And unlike those who relied on birthright and wealth, Caesar relied on observation, intellect, and timing. The system that sought to control him had underestimated the power of unseen influence. He began to act in shadows, nudging outcomes subtly. A miscalculated financial decision here, a veiled accusation there, enough to destabilize alliances without ever drawing direct suspicion. Families who once believed themselves untouchable began to falter, their arrogance weaponized against them by the very person they had deemed property. And through it all, Caesar maintained a presence of calm authority, a reminder that intelligence could not be enslaved. Margaret's fate, too, was quietly transformed. She had been the object of a horrific wager, yet she began to witness, through Caesar's quiet guidance, the fragility of those who once dominated her life. Knowledge became her shield. Observation became her weapon. In the silent corridors of Thorngate Manor, she started to understand the truth that men like Harrison had never learned. Power without moral awareness is a prison of one's own making. The county itself was bending under these subtle manipulations. Wealth shifted, reputations eroded, and political influence quietly realigned. Caesar, moving like a chess master unseen, ensured that the collapse of one system fed the rise of another, one built on intellect, observation, and patience rather than brute domination. Every decision he made was a calculated response to the hubris of those who had wagered human life for entertainment. And so the moral architecture of Virginia's elite began to crumble, quietly, invisibly, but irreversibly. The night of the poker game had been the spark, but the fire now spread through strategy, cunning, and the patient application of knowledge. Caesar Wellington became both witness and instrument of history's hidden correction, proving that the very system designed to oppress him could, in the hands of a mind capable of seeing its weaknesses, be turned into a weapon more powerful than any gun, law, or plantation. By the time the first winter after the wager arrived, Pennsylvania County was no longer recognizable. The outward appearance of prosperity remained. The tobacco fields still stretched like green oceans. The Georgian columns of Thorngate Manor gleamed in the sun, but beneath that veneer, the foundations had crumbled. Families once untouchable were fractured. Alliances that had lasted generations dissolved. and a sense of pervasive unease settled over the elite like a shadow that could not be shaken. Harrison Rutherford, once a figure of unquestioned authority, found himself ensnared in invisible forces he could not control. His investments faltered mysteriously, friends turned away silently, and the very social networks that had elevated him became instruments of his isolation. The mansion that had symbolized his dominance became a cage of paranoia. Every knock at the door, every whispered conversation, became a potential threat. The weight of his actions, the act of wagering a human life, pressured him until he teetered on the edge of madness. And yet, the physical destruction was mirrored by something darker. Unexplained deaths occurred in households connected to that night's game. Men with reputations for invulnerability fell ill and perished under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some called it divine justice, others whispered of calculated vengeance by those who had been wronged. Caesar Wellington, always present yet invisible in the broader societal sense, observed with a cold clarity, orchestrating outcomes subtly while remaining untouchable. He had transformed the chaos into leverage, ensuring that the arrogance of the powerful would exact its own punishment. Margaret, too, bore scars that no medicine could heal. Witnessing the unraveling of her father, the moral collapse of men she had once trusted, and the quiet manipulations that reshaped her world, she came to understand the devastating truth of privilege and power. It is never granted without cost, and its abuse invites consequences that spread far beyond the initial act. Her beauty, intelligence, and social position became a shield and a weapon, but also a reminder of vulnerability in a world where morality was a commodity few could afford. The ripple effect extended far beyond the Rutherford estate. Political alignments shifted quietly, as families ruined financially or socially withdrew from influence. Estates once thought permanent fell to ruin. Reputations became fragile, and a culture of subtle fear replaced the overt confidence of the old elite. The game, intended as amusement, had exposed the underlying fragility of a society built on domination, hierarchy, and illusion. And in the shadows of it all, a lesson persisted. Power without conscience is a slow-acting poison, one that eventually consumes both the wielder and the world around them. Those who believed themselves untouchable discovered that the smallest misstep and ill-conceived wager, a moment of hubris, could ignite destruction that generations could not escape. History, for those willing to see it, is not written by the victors alone. It is dictated by the consequences of human arrogance, the hidden forces that punish cruelty, and the minds capable of seeing what others refuse to acknowledge. Decades later, the ruins of Thorngate Manor still whispered secrets. The estate, once a monument to wealth and dominance, stood as a testament to the consequences of unchecked hubris. Nature began to reclaim the fields, vines curling over marble columns, shadows stretching across empty halls where laughter and strategy once lived. Those who survived carried the invisible scars of that night: fear, guilt, and the realization that some truths cannot be contained, no matter how tightly you control money, influence, or reputation. The descendants of Harrison Rutherford learned that inheritance was not simply a transfer of wealth, it was a burden of memory, a legacy of moral reckoning. Some families vanished quietly from prominence, their names fading from records, as if the universe itself demanded amends for the arrogance that had once ruled Spotsylvania County. Others attempted to reconstruct their status, only to discover that the past's weight could never be lifted. Every decision, every interaction, was shadowed by the invisible hand of consequence, a reminder that the human cost of ambition is rarely confined to a single lifetime. Caesar Wellington's influence persisted, though hidden from history books. His quiet interventions, once invisible, became the blueprint for understanding power in its most subtle form. Intellect over force, observation over intimidation, patience over impulse. In the calculus of human ambition, he had rewritten the rules. The men who had once dominated him were now subjects of a moral order they had ignored, their fates proof that knowledge and strategy, wielded with precision, can overturn even the most entrenched hierarchies. Margaret, scarred but awakened, carried the memory of that night as both curse and armor. She understood that beauty, status, and education could be instruments of manipulation or survival, but only when guided by awareness of hidden forces. She became a symbol, a quiet testament to resilience. The witness who survived the moral collapse around her and emerged capable of seeing the currents beneath the surface of power. This story, dark and unsettling as it is, carries a warning for anyone who believes themselves untouchable. Every act of hubris leaves traces. Every violation of morality ripples through time. Every wager made on human life, no matter how carefully concealed, exacts a cost. History may forget the names, bury the documents, and erase the details, but the consequences endure, echoing in the minds of those willing to see. If you remember nothing else from this descent, remember this: the true measure of power is not how much you can take, but how carefully you understand the forces around you. The night Harrison Rutherford bet his daughter against a man born into chains was not merely a story of one family's collapse, it was a lesson in the hidden architecture of influence, the invisible consequences of hubris, and the enduring truth that human life is never a game, no matter how much men would pretend it is. Some truths are too dangerous to speak, but tonight, you'll see them. Watch closely, because what happened at Thorngate Manor isn't just history, it's a blueprint of power, corruption, and consequence. Comment: the cards never lie twice if you understand the hidden forces shaping the world around you. And subscribe to uncover more forbidden knowledge that the elite tried to bury.